Stop the world!
We need to have a good understanding of what the problem is. The problem is not that there is disinformation out there. The problem is that there is a state actor or different state actors that are using these things as a tool of their foreign policy.
Welcome back to Stop the World, ASPI's weekly podcast on international affairs and security. I'm Steph Tiller. This week's episode comes to you from Brussels, where ASPI's Executive Director Justin Bassi interviewed the head of strategic communications at the European External Action Service, Lutz Güllner. The conversation is a deep dive into disinformation, foreign influence, manipulation, and interference. Justin and Lutz discuss the importance of countering state-backed disinformation and foreign influence campaigns, how these tactics can affect the resilience of open societies, and what can be done to deter them.
People don't trust media anymore. So let's be very clear, always demonstrate, always show the evidence, because that's the best antidote that we have.
With elections coming up in the European Union, the United States and the United Kingdom, they also discuss concerns around election interference and the types of campaigns that foreign actors are undertaking in an attempt to manipulate them.
We see a change in quality is, yes, it has become more difficult also to detect these things, and the way these things are developed and being played out become also quite sophisticated and complicated.
But for now, let's get into the conversation.
Well, it's great to be here in Brussels today at the Press Club, right near the European institutions. And it's absolutely fantastic to be joined by Lutz Güllner, the Head of Strategic Communications for the EU's External Action Service. Lutz, thanks for joining us on the ASPI podcast, Stop the World.
Thank you for having me. I'm really very pleased to be with you here.
And as the Head of Strategic Communications, you have responsibility for publicly raising awareness of and countering disinformation and foreign influence manipulation and interference. For many, these issues only became prominent after a series of elections only a few years ago in 2016, in particular the US election, but also, of course, Brexit. Your role, as I understand it, was set up and you started in 2017, so shortly after that. So a sign the EU had really identified a growing threat. Can you take our listeners through the genesis of that role and what your mission is?
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually, exactly a look at the history of it is always important to understand also the way we are organized today and what we are looking at, and even in identifying gaps, by the way. So actually, the real beginnings of this activity that my team is doing today comes from 2015. It was a year after the illegal annexation of the Crimea by Russia in Ukraine. And that was the moment that it was a very clear recognition that there were increasing disinformation campaigns being, let's say, deployed in Ukraine. And that were also very clearly identified by the actor and attributed, to the actor Russia. And at that moment, it was the heads of state and government of the European Union, our highest decision-making body, the European Council, that actually gave us a mandate to address these Russian disinformation campaigns. But that was in 2015, so quite some time ago. And of course, the situation has evolved. Also, our mandate has a bit evolved. We're not only looking at this one actor. We have seen how the issue of interference or disinformation, first of all, has developed, has changed, has morphed even a little bit. And I think if I look at the situation today, you just use the term that we're using. So foreign information manipulation and interference is a very deliberate term also to distinguish from the much broader and very complex issue of disinformation at large, which can be misinformation and domestic issues and many other forms. But we want to put an accent in particular on this foreign and security policy dimension.
That's great. Can you take us through the importance of that and helping ensure that the public doesn't just hold so much about disinformation and that everything can be disinformation, that they become complacent or it becomes routine? What is behind the need to talk beyond disinformation and into foreign influence manipulation?
Yeah, it's absolutely important to distinguish the different forms, the different phenomena that we are exposed to as society, as individuals. And I would maybe distinguish kind of the broader issue of disinformation, in particular when it comes to misinformation. Misinformation is also false information, misleading, can have real consequences, sometimes even dramatic consequences if we go to health, for example. But it has not been produced with an intention behind. So really, this idea of intention is the first one. The second issue is then, how do we distinguish kind of disinformation at a domestic level from the foreign policy dimension as well? Because they look relatively similar, let's call it like this. Very often they're interconnected, but still it's a big difference for a society, for a state, if this is a foreign state actor or if this is more a political domestic issue. So for us, this is crucial already to have this distinction about inside and outside. And the other element for us is, I said, there needs to be an intention. And we will also need to be always sure that it's not us to decide what is the disinformation, so that we don't get pushed into the role of a judge of what can be said and what cannot be said, what is legitimate, what is not legitimate. And I'm sure we come to this also in our conversation. But important for us is here this manipulative idea. And we can even measure it with specific instruments.
Yeah, some vital distinguishing features there that we, as governments, as civil society that considers foreign influence, manipulation or disinformation as a security threat, really important to break these things down, because there are some, particularly those who have significant online influence or those who claim to be free speech advocates, who simply say that what we say is disinformation or foreign influence is simply, alternative facts or just disagreement. So you have tried to explain disinformation and manipulation as, the quote from you was, a slow poison for our democracy. And I think this is a really important thing to understand. So can you explain to our listeners what you mean by disinformation being a poison, and how both disinformation and foreign information manipulation is impacting the resilience of democracy?
Yeah, but let me just go this step back, because this is a very important element about free speech. It's one of our absolute cornerstones in our values, be it in Australia, be it in the European Union. And it is our guiding compass, this freedom of speech, and no measure that would have any impact on that. And I get very often the question, so how can you address disinformation without falling into the trap? And the answer to that is, we are not the final judges of what can be said and what cannot be said. And why are we not falling into the trap? Because we don't do a content analysis in good and bad content, in true and false.
Yeah, you're not the moral police.
No, because even true and false, who has the role? It's certainly not the state's role and the authorities that can do this. Our approach is actually to look at what people are doing in this area. Not so much what they are saying, but which instrument that they are using, which techniques they are using to produce their elements or their activities, how they disseminate it, how they amplify it. And there we have relatively good objective indicators, which actually come a little bit from cybersecurity, where we can see just by the means what people are using. And I'll give you a few tangible examples. Bot networks, for example, inauthentic accounts, manipulation of identities, manipulation of reach, so technical approaches that give you a much bigger voice that you would have. And these things are manipulative in nature, and we have objective criteria to look at that. And therefore, I would never kind of like to have this debate. Is this now, how far can we go? When will this really impede on freedom of speech? We are actually safeguarding freedom of speech from manipulation from outside. If one of our citizens, who is maybe a great fan of wars of aggression or things like that, if they are genuine voices, they can say this. Of course they can say this. We may not like it, and we need to address it with our political means. But if a foreign state is either using these voices or doing that themselves by amplifying 10,000 times these voices, that is a real issue. And if this is done over a longer perspective, and just to answer your question on the slow poison, because these things don't happen overnight. Some people have this feeling that disinformation campaigns, This is the false narrative that hits like a bombshell. Everybody believes it. Everybody's confused. Can also happen, but it's very seldom, very seldom. What is happening here is a lot of different networks that are being created. It's a systemic investment, so to say, by the aggressor side of, let's say, proxies, of channels, of ways to engage. And very often these things are also combined with cyber tools, so hack and leak operations. And therefore, I think the biggest risk is actually not the short-term issue, it's more the medium to long-term issue. The more you hear certain narratives, at some point they socialize, at some point they become, people hear them. We get now into psychology, and I'm not a psychologist, but I hear that cognitive ways, if you are continuously exposed to a narrative, at some point, maybe you don't believe in this, but it's very familiar to you, and you're not that shocked anymore. And this is exactly what is being looked at.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, the risk of everyone becoming desensitized to all of these issues and not doing either individual due diligence or industry or government not doing their collective due diligence, whether it be fatigue or people who moved on or just thinking, well, that's just the way life is online. It's interesting. I couldn't agree more with you in terms of your commentary on free speech. As you said, in Australia, free speech is considered very important, but there's still a need to operate within rules, whether that's rules of the road that you drive on or the rules of the road online.
That's a very general issue that we also need to address as liberal democracies in particular, is when is the moment that our openness becomes a vulnerability? When people use it? When do they take advantage of this? And I think this is exactly this area where, of course, I mean, the openness we will safeguard, etc. But we need to develop intelligent tools and have intelligent ways of dealing with this issue that we can also defend ourselves. Otherwise, we just stand out there.
Completely agree. And it goes back also to what you said earlier around intention. Where is the separation point? That not everything online needs to be addressed as disinformation or foreign influence. But on that intention, I am a big believer, whether it be in relation to cyber intrusions or foreign interference or disinformation, in comprehensive response package involving or including attribution, public attribution. How important, in your view, is public attribution of information operations to both increase public awareness and hopefully deter future attacks?
Hugely important. I think it's one of our most powerful tools that we have, also in the spirit of our open society. And our aim is to empower our own citizens, of course, to be more aware of things, to empower them to take their own decisions. It's not the role of the state to take these decisions. And public attribution, or I would also expand it a little bit, public exposure of these techniques, of instances, of examples of these campaigns are hugely important. First of all, to empower people, as I said before, that they understand, oh, there's something, next time I see a similar pattern, maybe I look at it. But there is also this issue about legitimacy, because we always need to show, when we speak about disinformation, about information manipulation, and if we say there is a problem, we need to show how this problem looks like. And if we don't publish what we see, if we don't underline kind of these mechanisms, of course, we need to respect data protection as well here. But nevertheless, we do a lot, also our member states in this field. It's partly an educational perspective, partly a very political perspective. And of course, public attribution to a foreign state is inherently political, even diplomatic activity, which is not an easy thing, as we know also from cyber. And of course, there are even legal issues connected to that. But let's say in broader terms, the exposure of these things is important. And maybe an additional thought is, I'm a great fan of showing that we have here a serious issue at hand, or an issue at hand that we should take seriously. But at the same time, we should not hype the issue either. We should not make it bigger than it is, because we would fall into the traps of the attackers, who also do not only want to interfere in some of our debates, but who also want to delegitimize our media system, for example. And we see it in some of our places, let's call it like this, in the European Union, where people don't trust media anymore. So let's be very clear. always demonstrate, always show the evidence, because that's the best antidote that we have.
Really well said. I think it's crucial that we actually do everything we can to empower our citizens to make their own decisions. And in particular, as you said, we don't want to have to make the decisions for them, but we also don't want foreign governments or foreign intelligence services making their decisions for them. Lutz, the EU elections are coming up next month, so very soon. We will have US elections, likely UK elections later this year. And of course, there are ongoing concerns around election interference. Can you take us through what you're seeing and if there are any trends that have you concerned?
Yeah, so we're, of course, looking very, very closely at this already. The last elections, we had most of our operations already up and running, but now, of course, much more developed and sophisticated. And I think it's fair to say, as of today, that we see there are manipulation activities, also from foreign actors, at least based on the indicators that we have today. See the activities, but there is not a massive disruptive manipulation which would lead you to the conclusion that, oh my God, these elections will not be safe. And that's why it's, for me, always super important to mention, even if we see these manipulation activities, these elections are safe, they're valid, they're legitimate, and it's important to vote, because, as I said before, we should not fall into the trap. But what we are seeing, however, and to go a little bit more in detail, is maybe a little bit in volume of course, we can always discuss is there now more or less? What is your reference point? But what we see is a change in quality in particular. And that is the most noteworthy issue. What does that mean in terms of quality? These campaigns are a little bit more sophisticated. They use more sophisticated, even technical means. We had a campaign in the European Union which was attributed, called out, exposed even by our member states, by the French government, for example, but a few others as well, which was called Doppelgänger. And what did Doppelgänger consist of? It was a technical way of cloning websites of media with a good reputation, like The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel. But of course, the content was changed. So it's not easy to do this. I mean, it's maybe not the absolute ultimate difficulty, but nevertheless, you need resources to do this. You need technical means to do this. And this is not just, in inverted commas, dumb or stupid disinformation, but these are quite sophisticated campaigns then behind. And that's what I want to say. If I say we see a change in quality, is yes, it has become more difficult also to detect these things, and the way these things are developed and being played out become also quite sophisticated and complicated, I think.
And is that the impact you see of where we're headed with artificial intelligence? The impact is on both the quality and quantity and the speed of being able to engage in the manipulation. Where are you seeing AI take us in these areas?
I think the jury is still out there, but we should also not forget that AI, or at least automated tools, have been used in this field for a long time. Think about the bots system, etc. In the past, we could see these campaigns a little bit easier because a lot of mistakes were done in sloppy language use. Sometimes we had small letters from the Cyrillic alphabet all of a sudden in posts, which made people suspicious and started to look at. So these indicators will be more difficult to find because it is better in quality, better, of course, in inverted commas. It is faster and it's cheaper. But I would also say, let's not get into doomsday scenario mood, because we have not seen really a paradigm shift yet. Yes, we have seen deepfakes. Yes, we have seen also new instruments in audio and other things. And yes, we need to look at this not only very carefully, but we also need to prepare for this. But as of today, I would say no paradigm shift. It might come in the future, but not yet.
It's interesting, even without that paradigm shift, the concern I have goes to your delegitimacy point, that is there going to be so much disinformation, misinformation, manipulation online that even the accurate information is just distrusted by people.
That's exactly the point. I think many people still believe that information manipulation is a question of narratives. It's a question of communication. So who has the better message, the better narrative to deploy? I think it's much more than that, because the aims are not about communicating. It's not about who has the better, even if it's a misleading narrative. But sometimes it's also about dismaying people, about distracting, it's about distorting. in kind of the science behind or the academics that are working on this, there are different forms, the 4Ds, that's why I used a lot of words with D, but you could expand this further. But I think in the end, really, it's about putting confusion, mistrust, or conflict, etc., into a societal debate. And that's where we come back to this slow acting poison, that is part of the strategic aims in all this.
That aspect of the slow poison also resonates from a foreign policy, strategic policy perspective, in my view, because when we're dealing with particularly state-based actors who engage in this, dealing with a country like China, China will often have a very long-term strategic policy and strategic objectives in a way that liberal democracies can often look at things in terms of electoral periods. Let me take you, I suppose, now to a discussion more specific on the countries involved in this type of behaviour. Clearly, from a European perspective, you've already talked about the focus of the threat emanating from Russian disinformation that was being seen in Crimea 2015, the elections in 2016. In the Indo-Pacific, the major threat comes from the Chinese government and its proxies. We have seen, for example, a significant online information campaign, influence campaign by Chinese government proxies spreading disinformation about Japan's release of treated nuclear water. And we've also begun to see Russia and China working together, most recently in the lead up to elections in Solomon Islands. So the issue of one country amplifying another country's disinformation, there are so many aspects here. Do you think there are ways that the EU and its priorities and Indo-Pacific countries and our priorities can increase our own collaboration to identify, counter, and deter the combined threat of what we see coming out of Russia and China?
Oh, definitely. It's one of our most important agenda points in our international cooperation in this one. Information manipulation has become a global issue. It plays out in slightly different forms and ways, depending, of course, on the political culture, structure, on the issues that are being discussed. And that is also part of their strategy as well. If we look at the actors, well, we have, of course, a specific focus on what we call the pro-Kremlin disinformation ecosystem, also to be a little bit precise. We never single out an entire country as such, but we see state actors involved. And that gives us also rise to attribute it to the state, even if a lot of the proxies, as you said yourself, in the end will carry it out. But to answer your question, this cooperation between like-minded countries, especially those that have the same values compass, freedom of speech, fairness in our debates, a non-manipulative kind of interaction, let's call it like this, that we really need to work together. And we are doing that. And that's the good news. We are working as part of the G7. I know Australia is not a formal part of the G7, but we have the rapid response mechanism in the G7, where we work very closely also with Australia and other partners. There are other initiatives, also some of them are Australia-led. And what is the aim? Is number one, of course, to exchange our experience, best practice. How does this play out? Then, of course, compare notes. What are you seeing? What are we seeing? How do we understand it? And I think one of a major step forward that we have done is not only in identifying this threat in very general terms, but in quite concrete terms as well, because we see the methods that are being used. And this cooperation is crucial, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or whether it's in other parts of the world. Because even if you don't belong to the, in inverted commas, the West, I think there are a lot of countries in the end, a lot of societies, let's call it like this, that do not want to be manipulated from the outside, They do want to have, we want to have our own debate. And I certainly don't want to have an actor from outside in a non-visible, clandestine, obfuscated manner to interfere in this. And this is the issue. It's not about public diplomacy. This is about a malign activity, which is usually run in a covered way. And that is because I very often get this question. So what's the problem? This is what you're doing in your public diplomacy initiatives when you want to influence or to have an influence, with your own value system, etc. Say, yeah, but we do this openly and we do it in a transparent way. And we don't use bot networks and we don't use false identities. And that is the big difference.
Really, really well said. I'm often asked in these discussions, why are you so passionate about trying to counter disinformation and foreign influence and foreign interference? All politicians lie. Australian politicians try to influence me. And I couldn't put the answer better than what you just said. And I often reply that it's not about being naive to politicians looking to influence, but as long as we can have confidence that it's Australian politicians influencing the Australian public and not the covert means of a foreign intelligence service or a foreign government, that's the most important thing for a democracy. Everything you said there seems to me about what we can do working together to build democratic resilience, not to find some silver bullet to end all types of manipulation. Do you think as a part of that exchange of information, which is vital, as part of that cooperation that goes beyond the exchange of information, do you think Indo-Pacific countries like Australia and Japan should join the EU in more public discussions of specific cases to get global coverage for what you described in terms of information manipulation being a global threat? Do you think we should combine our forces on joint statements?
I think we do, well, not maybe in political formal joint attributions. Let's also keep in mind that these have then a legal value, etc. So it might also be a little bit complicated. I think that should be the perspective. If we have the evidence of that, we should be doing that, because we are not talking about an abstract issue here. As long as we have the evidence, and this is not a general issue where people then ask us, well, what makes you believe that? And that is, of course, also the way why I'm a staunch believer in open source analysis in this one. Of course, we have our intelligence community also working on this, and it is important that this is their role. But we keep it a little bit at arm's length from them, because I want to be able to go out there and say, we do have a problem because, and I can show it. Not I cannot show you the evidence.
Yes, just trust us.
It is exactly, because that will not work, in particular if it comes from a government or from a state authority. But I just wanted to come back to this point, how we have to understand it. We have a lot of disinformation also in the economic sphere, like advertisement, etc. And it's always a metaphor. My team always rolls the eyes when I do this, but it's a bit like in a supermarket, When you come to the supermarket, you will have people who want to buy junk food, who are hooked on junk food. They want it. It's okay, and we're not preventing them from doing so. But who are the people we want to empower and protect also in a way? It's those that go in there and don't want to be misled. They want to know what it is they are, not buying, of course, in the communication space, but what they're consuming, what they're hearing.
What the ingredients are.
Exactly. They want to have transparency. And if a podcast is linked to a state actor or sponsored or whatever, then please make sure that it is and not do as if this is a citizens' initiative, for example. So this idea of transparency, of accountability is very, very important in our work.
Completely agree with you. Transparency is one of those empowering tools. Could talk for a long time on these issues, Lutz, and you've been very kind with your time. Finally, as you complete your time in this role and you head to Taiwan as head of the EU's mission there, for which congratulations, what is your message for your successor and for liberal democracies like Australia, and what the next stage of countering disinformation is? Do we need more punitive action, for example, in relation to sanctions or collective responses?
Yeah, it could be a very long speech, because there's a lot of construction sites still out
notes,
there.
Handover notes.
A lot of my handover note will be very, very long, I know. But let me focus on three things. Number one is we need to have a good understanding of what the problem is. The problem is not that there is disinformation out there. The problem is that there is a state actor or different state actors that are using these things as a tool of their foreign policy. And that's where the security dimension is coming in. By the way, often in combination with other tools like cyber tools, etc. And it is part of the hybrid threats that we need to look at. I think this is really number one. Number two is it's not only a social media platform issue. Yes, it is to a large degree, but there are zillions of websites as well. There are commercial actors out there that are offering these services. It's an ecosystem that we need to look at. And maybe the third one then goes into this issue about resilience. We need to understand that this is not just an issue that we can do from top down. Government will solve the issues. This is a real issue, an all of society issue. I know people usually roll their eyes when we speak about all of society, because it looks as if nobody wants to take responsibility. But I'm a staunch believer in civil society organizations, researchers, think tanks, fact checkers, journalists, etc., and no specific order here, that we all need to play a role in this. Otherwise, it will be difficult to find a consensus as well. And of course, it will shift the consensus about what is acceptable in a society and what not. But I don't want to be manipulated, in particular not from the outside. I think this is the message, that we need to work on. And there are plenty of more technical construction sites. But
it's a very good message to your successor. We don't want to be manipulated. And I know I said that the last question was the final question, but the final question that I'd love to put to you and to help all our listeners who may have enjoyed everything you said today, as part of the education process on this and finding out more information, is there a book that you'd recommend our listeners go out and buy on this topic?
Well, beside, of course, the publication of my own team, in particular our reports and our EU versus Disinfo website,
goes without saying,
I would recommend a book from Thomas Rid, which is called Active Measures. It looks at Russian disinformation campaigns from a historic perspective, because disinformation is not new. It's decades, hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years old. But he shows how the digital world context has actually changed things. But the intentions remain pretty similar to the past. But it's a brilliant book, and there are plenty of others, but that was a bit my eye-opener.
A great recommendation. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
That's all we have for you this week on Stop the World. If you have any feedback on the new podcast, we'd love to hear from you at podcast@aspi.org.au. And as always, be sure to follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.